This is the Open University. But beware, this is not the real Open University, but a synthetic and mendacious Open University devised by Momus, a Scottish electronic folk singer.
Synthetic Open University.
A random series of talks by Momus, the gaunt minstrel of modern angst.
Welcome back to the Open University, which of course is not the real Open University. And I don't have any script today, I don't have any plans for what I'm going to talk to you about. It's just a ramble. And I enjoy these rambles. I enjoy turning 0 into 1, turning nothing into something. A lot of the vlogs I watch are actually people just rambling about what they're up to, what they're about to be up to, and what's exciting them in their lives. God knows that we're going through a strange time if you're reading the newspapers. I don't need to ram home how awful certain developments are, but in the meantime, our lives here in Europe go on. I live in a city with a socialist mayor, so socialism goes on of a sort. A lot of cycle lanes anyway. Is that socialism? It's cyclism, I suppose. Things come in cycles. Actually, it occurred to me that a lot of the best developments in human politics have come out of terrible times, like the post-war settlement that we're sort of now seeing destroyed, according to a lot of commentators, came out of people's revulsion against and rejection of Hitlerism. And therefore, what's happening now in the US is setting us up for possibly some nice counter-reactions and reactions, dialectics later on down the line. So thank you for incarnating evil, you guys over there. You know who I'm talking about. I'm not talking about them though, because I'm not living in their world, frankly. I'm off to Asia soon, which is always such a refreshing experience. Flying to Beijing initially and then to Seoul for a few days, just to catch up on what's been happening in Seongsu mostly, because things change very quickly, especially in the happening districts. So I'll be staying in a hotel in Seongsu with my beloved Noemi, and then heading off to 6 weeks in Kyoto, because we're doing an apartment exchange, me and Mai Ueda, who you might remember from the art exhibition we had together in New York in 2005, back when New York was cool, called You Speak, I'll Sing, in which Mai Ueda sang, actually. No, it was called I'll Speak, You Sing. So I improvised with a kind of red hood over my head, stories in the gallery every day, performance art, and Mai Ueda pranced about, mostly wearing very short dresses, and sang these songs which she'd written, like Don't Call Me Elephant was one of them, as I recall. Anyway, Mai Ueda is coming to live in this tiny Parisian apartment, and we will live in her tiny Kyoto apartment, which is near the Kamo River. And I think we'll be doing a lot of exploring of parts of Kansai that I've never been to, like I'd never been to Morimoto before, which is just north of Kyoto on Lake Biwa. We'll be heading down every day to Osaka to look at the arcades and the rundown, more Shitamachi kind of areas in Osaka, because Kyoto doesn't really have those. It is over-touristified, as everyone likes to say now. I find this language a little bit threatening, because it seems to be part of the reaction against globalization and of harmony and of people accepting people from other countries happily into their own. Even when tourist economies like Spain's or like Japan's really become more and more dependent on tourism, there is this kind of talk about tourism going too far and pushing rents up. And some of those are real problems, but others are part of a reactionary tendency against foreigners of any kinds and against the movement, the free movement of people. So I'm still very much in favor of that. Of course, there are ecological downsides. We're taking the shortest flight we can across Russia with the Chinese airline. So we're hoping things don't flare up between now and mid-April in terms of the geopolitics. But Yeah, that's going to be fun. And the great thing about having a trip like that in a couple of months is that you're already living in it mentally before you go. And I feel, every day I can sort of sift through things, flag things on Google Maps that I want to go and see. Google Maps, though, is terrible especially for Korea, South Korea. It doesn't really understand names, and it doesn't know what things are and where things are, because everyone uses Naver maps there. So anyway, yes, I'm kind of flagging things up to do in a couple of months' time. Just released this cover version of White Town's Your Woman, and that has already been going very well. I actually did it in early February, but had to release it on the 22nd because it was for a birthday present and it was going to be a surprise. So I kept going back to that and remixing it, putting new elements in, and I think the Ashes to Ashes piano line was one of the last things I put in, along with some sort of siren sounds and sine waves, and it's got quite a lot in there. It's a bit of a kitchen sink mix, but I think it preserves the original funkiness, which you don't hear so much when people do covers. If you look, there are a few covers out there on the interwebs on YouTube of people doing covers of that song, and not really keeping in for instance, the funky breakdown in the middle, which I think is so fantastic. Jyoti Mishra was a friend in just about when he was having his #1 hit with that song back in the 90s, and I'd come back from Paris. I was living here in Paris in the mid-90s and came back to London early 97, and Jyoti just kind of appeared as one of, there was Orlando, there was Jack, there was White Town. There was sort of a coterie of people who were actually welcoming me back to London and saying, we're influenced by your songs, and we like what you've done, and we're making material like that. So I did an album with Anthony from the band Jack. Jyoti, I remember meeting up with at the ICA and places like that, and he would always be so encouraging and say, listen, I've got a #1 single, and you could have, if I can do this at home with home productions, you could as well. Didn't turn out to be the case, but I loved the optimism, and it worked for him. He didn't really manage to follow up his #1 hit single with anything. EMI dropped him later in 1997. Kind of crazy, but they didn't like the demos he was producing for his follow-up material, which was, if anything, more Momus-like. Actually, maybe that's why they dropped him. But I could understand where he was coming from. Of course, he's influenced very much by Pennies from Heaven, the sort of 1920s style, and the sample he uses, the trumpet sample, which I think he had to pay for. I think the estate of some 1920s trumpeter came after him. But he cited Dennis Potter's Pennies from Heaven as an influence. And of course, everything goes back to David Bowie for me, so I had to bring, in the video, I brought the Ashes to Ashes thing home with using a Justin Hayward video, which David Mallet had filmed at near Hastings on a beach for the Kenny Everett video show, who were his employers at the time, in 1978. And David Bowie must have seen this video, because it not only uses the same location as the Ashes to Ashes video, which of course came 2 years later in 1980, but uses the same video techniques. I think he might have been using a Quantel paint box or something like that. Quite primitive video equipment for the Kenny Everett video show. It's really startling to see this rather, middle of the road ballad by a member of the Moody Blues, filmed in this science fiction, what we now think of as a science fiction landscape of the black sky and the strange kind of rock pools and cliffs, very kind of otherworldly planetary landscape, familiar from Ashes to Ashes. So that's how I thought the sort of gender ambiguity in the Your Woman lyric, which Jyoti has said could be about a Marxist man who's trying to seduce a Marxist woman, or it could be about a gay man trying to seduce a straight man. He's got about 6 different narrative perspectives in there, possible interpretations, which is what makes it a great song. It's not, you're not limited to any one take. When I first heard it, I thought it was saying, I could never be a woman, which brings a whole other slant to it. But your woman, yeah, so there's lots of ambiguity there, which is very Bowie-ish, you know, and also not just the gender ambiguity, but the narrative perspective ambiguity, which is something Bowie always liked. This is why he used cut-ups, to get this kind of multi-perspective, none of which he's necessarily endorsing, but you get narrators, you get a newspaper article, and they're all cut up, you know, there might be there's a lot of different views on the same events in Bowie's song. This is how he post-rationalized them anyway. Perhaps they were just sort of a bit random and a bit sort of nonsensical and chopped up. In some places they were lazy, it was a lazy way to write, but it was also a sophisticated and subtle way to write when it worked. So that was that cover, and you seem to be liking it out there. I don't know if the versions that I continue to do for $100 a pop are going to come out on CD at some point. I have a new record coming out. Should be pretty much the end of this month. They should get stock back.
Quietism is the brilliant and disquieting new album from Momus.
It's called Quietism, as you probably know by now, because my last videos have all been about it. And it's kind of bossa nova, and it's kind of AI, and it's kind of a Momus record, and it's darker than the previous album, which was the K-pop AI album. I don't know if I'll keep using AI. I'm sort of getting a bit bored with starting songs with AI. I think I'd rather start them with my guitar perhaps next time. Who knows? But I mean, the trip to Asia will probably influence whatever comes next. I promised you something about books I'd been reading. So I think I talked in reference to the song Imposter Syndrome last time about the talented Mr. Ripley, although I couldn't remember the title when I was talking to you last time. But I decided to go off and read the book, which was very gripping, very impressive and tense. And the idea of somebody murdering someone and taking over his identity, and then doing more and more outrageous things, writing him into this person's will himself, befriending the parents of this murdered person, murdering more people to cover up his tracks. And you expect it all to end out very badly, but it doesn't. In fact, some of the filmed versions, they do give it a kind of moralistic ending where he gets arrested and sent to prison. But in, spoiler alert, in Patricia Highsmith's book, he never actually pays the price. He goes off and starts a new life in Greece. So, which is much more interesting, I think. It's much, and she was able to take the character and write rather more mediocre books about this same Ripley, or using the same name anyway. Sometimes a bit hard to believe he's the same person, but of course, fluidity of identity is very central to what she was writing about. I mean, people like Max Frisch were writing about the same thing in Switzerland at the same time. She went to live in Switzerland. She was in exile from the US. It's interesting to think of books like I'm Not Stiller being written kind of coterminously with the talented Mr. Ripley. I just knew it initially from the film, the late 90s film. I think it was 1999 the film came out. And it's a good film, but it doesn't, the book has this kind of tension which the film I think doesn't quite capture. There've been 3 films at least, including one with Alain Delon. That's the one with the happy ending. That's the first film of it, which was from the early 60s. But a rip-roaring read. The other things I've been reading, well, I read the Will Hodgkinson book, Street Level Superstar, which is about Lawrence, and of course that was very resonant for me. It's a very good book, very well written, and it just walks this very subtle line between making fun of Lawrence for his eccentricities and loving him and valuing him for being an interesting person in this world of crushing conformity. So I found it riveting because I know Lawrence very well. I've known him since the 80s. We were on Cherry Red and on Creation together. We both made that move. And he was dating Vicky. Vicky is quite a major character in this book because she was his girlfriend for a while in the late 80s and early 90s. And I was living with Vicky from 1990 onwards. I knew her because she worked at Creation Records as a receptionist for a while, and then quit that and started working at the Design Council. And so we flatted together entirely platonically for 3 years in the early 90s, from, in my album terms, from Monsters of Love to Time Lord. And got on really well. I really liked Vicky, and she went back to New Zealand and left me her entire record and book collection, which is actually a very good record collection. Some of it probably Lawrence's records and books, or things that he had endorsed and approved. But the thing about Lawrence is, I mean, there's a clinical way you could describe him as autistic or OCD or whatever. I mean, he's difficult to work with because he's such a perfectionist, and he's got such a worldview. There's a kind of tragedy built into people like Lawrence, and probably me as well, that we spend our lives building up a way of seeing and a worldview and a sense of aesthetic, an aesthetic hierarchy in which some things are good and some things are bad. Like Lawrence would say hi-hats were bad, or you know, don't play the black notes on the piano, or he would give these ridiculous instructions to his musicians, or the exact positioning of a barcode on a piece of, I mean, he's a great graphic designer. I think he's a very interesting design head, and his songs, for me, got more and more interesting, have become more and more interesting. I think I never really was a Felt fan. I thought Felt were a sort of wishy-washy Sub-Lou Reed tribute band. Yeah, Lawrence is, the clinical way you could describe Lawrence is probably the least interesting way. I think Lawrence, it's more like he's an Andy Warhol kind of character, really, that, you know, there's a certain kind of, an apparent, I mean, Warhol was more positive about it. Like, Warhol would just say everything was great, but there was a kind of, there was a hierarchy within the great that was actually very strict. And you could see it certainly in his visual material, the way that he was developing his aesthetic as he went through his art life. Lawrence has arrived at a sort of weird novelty retro style, which I really like. I think the Mozart Estate and Go-Kart Mozart records are fantastic, in the sense that they give, like a Warhol print or painting, they give you surface, and they sort of let you make, they omit a moral perspective on what he's singing about, or you know, the electric chairs of Andy Warhol, whatever it is. He's not editorializing about, you know, the death penalty. He's just saying, look, we can make this aesthetic, and it says a lot about our society. And so Lawrence's songs, you know, there's one about I'm depressed, the depression song, whatever. It's simply an observation, and there's a kind of almost, because there's no emotion in the way he presents the topic, it kind of gives a space, provides a space for you to add your own emotions and to feel sorry for him, or sorry for the narrator, sorry for yourself, for being depressed, whatever. It just works really well. And I remember when I lived on Long Lane near the Barbican in the late 90s, I was really into Japanese pop, and I had all these CDs from people like Takako Minekawa, and Lawrence came round and I was playing him all this stuff. Cloudy Cloud Calculator had just come out by Takako Minekawa, and Lawrence was really fascinated by it, or I don't know, Yukari Fresh. You know, there's the Shibuya Kei, the weirder fringes, or Cornelius, you know, Phantasma, the weirder fringes of Shibuya Kei had some really interesting artists doing really interesting sort of conceptual pop music. Not math rock, you know, not Beastie Boys rap or whatever, but sort of adjacent to that in some ways. And especially the women artists I found very interesting. I mean, I love Hirono Nishiyama, Gutevolk, all these people. I continue to find it really amazing what they achieved at that time. And so Lawrence, you know, his ears were really open to all that stuff. And he went away and kind of, I mean, in my telling of the story, he sort of, that was like a corner he turned, and then this novelty rock thing. I mean, that had been present in Denim. I knew, I mean, what's so interesting for me about reading the book is that I knew Donna, who he went off to live with briefly in New York. He didn't end up liking New York because it didn't live up to the dreams he had of it from, I don't know, the Velvet Underground and Johnny Thunders and all these kind of things. But so he left. I mean, when I went to New York in my own right, a decade or so later, I stuck it for a couple of years and had a really good time, actually. I found New York liberating and sort of went out a lot more than Lawrence probably did. I think Lawrence stayed in, and Britpop was happening, and he felt he was missing out on Britpop and all the action was elsewhere. I was in New York at the time of Electro Clash, which now sounds very quaint and dated, but at the time was hot and happening. But yeah, so I compare myself to Lawrence, and in some ways I feel very blessed, and in other ways I kind of admire what he's done and almost envy his profile now, that you can achieve that as a British eccentric in contemporary Britain. I mean, the book has a lot of play about Lawrence always being on the verge of celebrity and having a bust made of his head, you know, and going to the opening, meeting a member of the Guinness family who's going to catapult him into the high society, modelling for Rick Owens, which actually impressed me that Rick Owens was looking for cadaverous, vampiric figures, and Lawrence fitted the bill. So Lawrence walked in a catwalk show last year for Rick. Rick, a very interesting character. Actually, one of the things I've been enjoying on YouTube is Bella Freud has this series where she's the granddaughter of Sigmund Freud, of course, and the daughter of Lucian Freud, the painter. So she has this series where people lie on her couch and she asks them questions in a slightly affected way, but it brings out, you know, in interesting subjects anyway, it brings out interesting answers. And her interview with Rick Owens is actually very good. What else can I recommend to you? I've also been reading The Quest for Corvo, which is a book, I think A.F. Simons, wrote it, and it's a kind of very fascinating look into the British eccentric and rather crabby and horrible personality Frederick Rolfe, also known as the Baron Corvo, whose most famous book is Hadrian VII, in which a slighted and benighted English would-be cleric somehow, by some freak of history, becomes Pope. Actually, it might happen. The current Pope is very ill and might die at any moment, so it might happen to some weird homosexual Catholic in England. Who knows? But I think Corvo's life is kind of, in a sense, more interesting than his book. Although his vocabulary and his style is fantastic, and you know, there's a tradition which also would take in people like Ronald Furbank, books like The Eccentricities of Cardinal Perelli, of dandyish Catholic homosexual British prose, or queer, I should probably say, British prose, which I find very interesting, very sympathetic. So there's this book, The Quest for Corvo, which is essentially Simon's writing to people who had known Rolfe, who was by this time already dead. I think the book was written in the 20s and Rolfe had already died, in penury, rather prematurely, in Venice. And it starts off with an account of the awful collection of letters which a gay friend in England had been receiving from Rolfe, trying to lure him to Venice, partly to give money to Rolfe, but also to experience the gay life with the gondoliers and the boys in Venice. So there was so much about how awful this book, the Venice Letters of Corvo, was, that I had to go and find that as well. So I got a copy of that and was reading that in tandem with the Simons book, which is mostly letters from people who knew Corvo in England. All of them had problems with him because his personality was so acerbic, and he felt so superior and so entitled in many ways, and literally titled. I mean, his Baron Corvo title was simply, you know, given to him on very, very dubious pretexts by an Italian family he happened to stay with. But I find it a fascinating rabbit hole to go down. So that's pretty much how things are looking from Momus Mansions this month. And enjoy the White Town cover, and you know, check out my Patreon and my Bandcamp if you're so inclined. Buy a CD from Darla if you are into CDs, into physical media. And I will see you next time.
Open University.
Now, Bob Harris introduces this week's edition of the Old Grey Whistle Test.